Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Holmes Stories, Inkwing Audio.
The transition from 1894 to 1895 had been ushered in by a fog so dense and yellow that it seemed to have muffled the very soul of London. From the windows of 221B Baker Street, the street lamps appeared as nothing more than sickly, blurred nebulae in a sea of charcoal vapour. Inside, however, the hearth blazed with a cheerful defiance, though its warmth did little to soothe the restless energy of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For 3 days, the great detective had been a creature of shadows and silence. He had spent the better part of the New Year's Eve night scrapbooking his records of the Adair case, and now, on the morning of the 1st of January, he sat huddled in his armchair, his thin knees drawn up to his hawk-like nose, staring with unsettling intensity at a singular flake of ash on the hearthrug. "You have been to the jeweller's, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. I started, dropping the British Medical Journal onto my lap. "I beg your pardon?" "The jeweller's, specifically the establishment of Mr. Falconer in the Strand. I should imagine you went to have the clasp of your pocket watch reinforced, though why you chose a day of such wretched weather is beyond my humble powers of conjecture." I laughed, though I was inwardly staggered. "This is too much, Holmes. You have not left that chair since the sun rose." I did indeed visit Falconer's, and it was indeed for my watch clasp. But how in the name of all that is holy could you know? Holmes uncurled himself, a thin smile playing upon his ascetic features. He gestured vaguely toward my left sleeve. "Observation, my dear doctor. You have a peculiar habit of resting your forearm on the velvet display counters when you wait for a receipt. Falconer's is the only shop in London that still uses a specific deep crimson powdered polish for their mahogany wood, a polish that leaves a microscopic residue of rouge-coloured dust. A faint trace of it adheres to your cuff. Furthermore, as you lean forward to pick up your journal, I notice the glint of a new, sturdier silver pin on your watch chain. The deduction is elementary, yet the execution of the repair is quite masterful." "It is a gift, Holmes," I remarked, shaking my head. "It is a curse, Watson," he countered, his expression darkening as he stood to pace the room. "The brain is a locomotive that must have rails to run upon. Without a problem to solve, it grinds itself to pieces. London is a stagnant pool. The criminal classes have become lamentably unimaginative. A new year has dawned, yet I fear it brings nothing but the same old tedious transgressions." He had barely finished his sentence when a frantic, rhythmic pounding echoed from the street door below. It was not the polite knock of a visitor, but the desperate summons of a soul in terror. "Aha!" Holmes cried, his eyes igniting with a sudden predatory brilliance. "The game, it seems, has heard my complaints and decided to provide a rebuttal." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson showed in a young man whose appearance was a portrait of disarray. He was dressed in the formal evening attire of the previous night, a fine tuxedo and silk waistcoat, but his collar was torn, his top hat was missing, and his face was as pale as the fog outside. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost and had been running from it ever since. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, clutching the back of a chair for support. "My name is Arthur Pendergast. I come from Hillingdon Manor. A terrible thing, an impossible thing has happened." Holmes moved with the grace of a cat, guiding the young man into the armchair I had just vacated. "Pray, compose yourself, Mr. Pendergast. A glass of brandy, Watson. The lad is shivering. Now, sir, tell us everything. Start at the beginning, but do not omit the end, for in the conclusion of a mystery often lies the seed of its beginning." The young man swallowed the brandy in a single gulp, the colour returning slowly to his cheeks. "It concerns the Hillingdon timepiece, Mr. Holmes," Pendergast began, his voice trembling. "As you may know, my uncle, Lord Hillingdon, possesses the most famous collection of horological artefacts in Europe. The centrepiece is a clock commissioned by Louis XIV, encrusted with the Star of the East sapphire. It is kept in a specialized vault, a room with walls of reinforced steel, accessible only by a single door with a triple locking mechanism." "A formidable cage for a bird of such plumage," Holmes remarked, leaning back and joining his fingertips. "Last night, we held our annual New Year's masquerade," Pendergast continued. "At precisely 1 minute to midnight per tradition, the guests gathered in the great hall. The vault is visible from the hall through a reinforced glass viewing port. We all watched, my uncle, myself, the servants and 30 guests, as the clock began its chime. We saw the sapphire glinting under the electric lights inside the vault. The door was locked. The guards stood outside. No one entered, no one left. And then? I asked, leaning forward. The clock struck 12. The lights inside the vault flickered, just for a second, no more. And when they steadied, the pedestal was empty. The Hillingdon timepiece had vanished into thin air, Mr. Holmes. In the space of a heartbeat, while 40 pairs of eyes were fixed upon it, the impossible occurred. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The door remained locked, sealed tight. My uncle had the only key in his pocket. We opened it immediately after. The room was empty. No tunnels, no trapdoors, nothing but the cold stone floor and the smell of ozone. Holmes stood up. His boredom vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated energy of the hunter. A locked room, a vanished treasure, and a house full of masked strangers, Holmes murmured, reaching for his heavy ulster coat. Watson, if you are not too enamored with your medical journals, I suggest you arm yourself. We leave for Hillingdon Manor at once. It appears the new year has brought us a riddle that defies the very laws of physics. The journey to Hillingdon Manor was conducted in a silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels against the frozen ruts of the road. Holmes sat enveloped in his heavy ulster, his chin sunk deep into his chest, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the swirling fog beyond the window. I knew better than to disturb him when he was in such a brown study. He was mentally reconstructing the vault at Hillingdon, testing the laws of physics against the impossible disappearance of the Louis XIV timepiece. Hillingdon Manor emerged from the gloom like a jagged tooth of grey stone. It was a sprawling Tudor-style edifice, its gables draped in ivy that looked like skeletal fingers in the winter chill. As we dismounted, the front door was flung open by a tall, aristocratic man whose face was a mask of silvered anxiety. This was Lord Eustace Pendergast, the owner of the vanished treasure. "Mr. Holmes, thank God you have come," he cried, ushering us into a great hall that still bore the remnants of the previous night's revelry. Withered garlands hung from the rafters, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of spilled champagne lingered in the air. "The police are baffled. Inspector Gregory is currently interrogating the kitchen staff, but he is looking for a thief when he should be looking for a sorcerer. In my experience, my lord, sorcery is rarely the motive for grand larceny," Holmes remarked dryly, his eyes already scanning the room with predatory efficiency. "Show us this impossible chamber." Lord Eustace led us down a long gallery, lined with ancient portraits, to a heavy iron-bound door. Beside it stood 2 stalwarts from the local constabulary, looking thoroughly sheepish. "This is the entry," Lord Eustace explained, producing a heavy, intricate key from his waistcoat. "The lock is a triple-levered Chubb, modified to my own specifications. Only this key can turn the tumblers. I had it in my pocket from the moment the guests arrived until the moment we discovered the loss." He turned the key and the heavy door groaned open. We stepped into a small, windowless square of a room. It was Spartan in its simplicity, white-tiled walls, a reinforced concrete floor, and in the center, a marble pedestal that now stood barren. A single electric bulb, shielded by a wire cage, cast a harsh, unforgiving light over the scene. "You mentioned a smell of ozone, Mr. Pendergast," Holmes said, his voice echoing in the confined space. He did not look at the pedestal yet. Instead, he dropped to his hands and knees, crawling across the floor with a magnifying glass held to his eye. "Yes," the younger Pendergast replied, standing by the door. "Like the air after a lightning strike. It was quite pungent when we first entered." Holmes sniffed the air deeply, his nostrils quivering. "It has dissipated now, replaced by the scent of damp wool and... Ah, what have we here?" He had reached the base of the marble pedestal. With a pair of tweezers, he picked up a tiny, translucent shard, no larger than a grain of salt. He held it up to the light, his expression unreadable. "A fragment of glass, Holmes?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder. "No, Watson. It is far more interesting than glass. It is a crystalline flake of potassium nitrate, saltpeter, highly purified." He placed it in a small glass envelope. "And look here, at the base of the pedestal. Do you see the faint circular scoring on the marble?" I peered down. There was indeed a light, almost invisible scratch forming a perfect ring around the top of the plinth where the clock had sat. A mechanical turntable, I ventured. Perhaps, Holmes murmured. He then turned his attention to the viewing port, a thick pane of reinforced glass set into the wall facing the great hall. He examined the edges of the frame with obsessive care. Lord Eustace, you say the lights flickered for a single second? Less than that, sir. A mere blink. And in that blink, a clock weighing 40 pounds, encrusted with jewels, vanished through solid steel or reinforced glass, leaving behind only the smell of a thunderstorm and a grain of saltpeter. Holmes stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. His eyes were sparkling with that peculiar light that signaled his mind was operating at its highest capacity. "Tell me, Lord Eustace," Holmes said, turning suddenly. "Among your guests last night, was there anyone particularly interested in, shall we say, the more theatrical sciences, a chemist perhaps, or a man with a penchant for high-voltage electricity?" Lord Eustace frowned. There was Professor Vane, the physicist, and of course the Count Silvius, who has a renowned collection of minerals, but they were both in the hall, in full view of everyone, when the lights flickered. Holmes paced the small room, his footsteps sounding hollow. 40 witnesses, a locked vault, a flash of darkness. It is a stage-managed miracle, Watson, and like all miracles, it relies entirely on our willingness to look at the wrong hand. He stopped in front of the glass port, looking out into the great hall where the servants were clearing away the New Year's debris. "The clock is not the only thing that has changed in this room since yesterday," Holmes whispered, more to himself than to us. "The geometry is wrong. Something is missing, Watson, and it isn't just the Star of the East. The library of Hillingdon Manor was an austere sanctuary of mahogany and leather, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical vacuum of the vault we had just vacated. Inspector Gregory of Scotland Yard, a tall, stolid man with a reputation for dogged persistence if not for imaginative leaps, was already seated at a heavy desk, surrounded by a mountain of guest lists and statements. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," Gregory cried, rising with a mixture of relief and professional wariness. "I heard you had arrived. I suppose Lord Eustace felt the Yard's boots were a bit too heavy for his Persian rugs." "Not at all, Gregory," Holmes said smoothly, tossing his hat onto a bust of Cicero. "I merely find that the new year offers so few intellectual refreshments that I could not resist the lure of a locked room. What have your inquiries yielded, aside from the obvious fact that 40 people cannot simultaneously be in 2 places at once?" Gregory sighed, tapping a folder. "It's a muddle, sir. 30 guests, 10 servants. All were in the great hall for the countdown. I've checked the timing. The lights flickered at 11:59 and 40 seconds. By 12 and 5 seconds the shout went up. That leaves 25 seconds of darkness or near darkness. But the vault door was guarded by 2 men, reliable fellows from the village, who swear no one passed them." "And the guests?" Holmes asked, his eyes roaming the shelves of books, though I knew he was listening with every fibre of his being. "2 stand out," Gregory admitted, lowering his voice. "Professor Vane, the physicist from Cambridge. He's been seen skulking near the vault all week, taking measurements for what he calls an experiment in light refraction. And then there is Count Silvius, a dark horse, that one. Foreign title, mountains of debt, and a known expert on precious stones. He was seen wearing a heavy Venetian cloak during the masquerade, plenty of room to hide a clock if he could get to it. And where are these gentlemen now? In the drawing-room awaiting your, interference, I believe were the Count's words. We transitioned to the drawing-room, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the brittle tension of a crime scene. Professor Vane was a man of nervous orbs and twitching fingers, his academic gown replaced by a rumpled tweed suit. Opposite him sat Count Silvius, a man of striking, predatory beauty, his dark eyes flashing with a dangerous amusement. "This is an outrage," Vane sputtered as we entered. "I am a Fellow of the Royal Society. To suggest I used my knowledge of electricity to bypass a triple-levered Chubb lock and vanish 40 pounds of gold and sapphire?" Holmes finished for him, his voice silky. "It would be a feat worthy of more than a fellowship, Professor. It would be a miracle." Holmes ignored the Count entirely for a moment, stepping toward a small side table where Vane's luggage, already searched by Gregory, sat open. He reached in and pulled out a heavy, copper-wound induction coil and a series of glass plate batteries. "Your research equipment, I presume?" Holmes asked. "For my studies on the luminosity of gases," Vane cried. "The ozone smell you reported. It is a byproduct of my work, yes, but I was in the hall. Ask anyone. I was standing next to the punch bowl when the lights dimmed." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, turning the induction coil over in his hands. He then turned his gaze to Count Silvius. The Count did not flinch. He leaned back, exhaling a plume of smoke. "And you, Count? Did you find the punch bowl equally captivating?" "I find English traditions tedious, Mr. Holmes," the Count replied in a rich liquid baritone. "I was watching the clock, or rather, the space where the clock used to be. It was a most professional disappearance. If I had done it, however, I would not have left such a clumsy trail of ozone and sparks. It lacks elegance." Holmes's eyes drifted downward, settling on the Count's boots. They were made of the finest calfskin, polished to a mirror sheen, but I noticed Holmes's brow furrow slightly. He then looked at the Count's hands. The nobleman wore a signet ring, but his fingernails were trimmed with an almost surgical precision. "Gregory," Holmes called out, his voice suddenly sharp. "You searched the professor's room?" "Thoroughly, sir. Found those batteries and a set of schematics for the manor's electrical wiring. And the Count's? Nothing but silk shirts and a very expensive bottle of cologne." Holmes smiled, but it was a cold, mechanical expression. "Then the case is indeed solved, Gregory. You have your man. The evidence of the induction coil, the wiring schematics, and the professor's proximity to the vault during his measurements form a chain that would hang a giant." Professor Vane let out a strangled cry of protest, but Holmes held up a hand. "However," Holmes added, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room, "there is one small difficulty. Watson, do you remember the grain of saltpeter I found on the pedestal?" "Of course," I replied. "Saltpeter is an oxidizer," Holmes mused, pacing the rug. "It is used in gunpowder, yes, but also in the preservation of certain biological specimens. Professor Vane, do you use saltpeter in your experiments with luminosity?" "Certainly not," Vane barked. "It has no place in a vacuum tube." "Then," Holmes said, stopping abruptly in front of a heavy velvet curtain that draped the far window, "we must ask ourselves why the scent of ozone is so strong near the professor's equipment, yet the saltpeter was only found inside the sealed vault. It is a discord in the symphony, Watson, a note played out of tune." He turned back to Gregory. "Keep them both under watch. Do not let the Count leave the grounds, and do not let the professor near his research for the moment. There is a third party in this house, one who does not wear a mask, yet remains entirely invisible." As we left the room, I hurried to catch up with my friend's long strides. "Holmes, you surely don't believe Vane is innocent. The evidence is overwhelming." "It is deliciously complete, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes dark with suspicion. "It is so complete, so perfectly tailored to the inspector's sensibilities, that it must be a forgery. We are being shown a play, my dear doctor. Now we must go and find the stage manager." While Inspector Gregory proceeded with the formal questioning of the household, Holmes retreated to the manor's sun-drenched morning room. To a casual observer, he appeared to be merely lounging, his long, thin frame stretched out in a chaise longue, but the rhythmic drumming of his fingers against his chin told me that his mental machinery was at full throttle. "Watson," he said, without looking up, "what do you make of the light?" "The flicker?" I asked, settling into a chair opposite him. "Pendergast said it lasted no more than a second. A momentary surge in the electrical current, I should think." "A surge or a deliberate interruption," Holmes mused. "But consider the timing." The clock was visible through the glass port. 40 people saw it. Then a blink of darkness. When the light returned, the pedestal was bare. If the thief entered the vault, he had to unlock a triple-levered chub, lift a 40-pound clock, exit and relock the door, all in the space of a heartbeat. It is a physical impossibility. Therefore, we must question the premise. The premise that the clock was there at all, precisely, or rather the premise of what they were seeing. Holmes stood up and began to pace the narrow confines of the room. "The human eye is a remarkably easy organ to deceive, Watson. It sees what it expects to see. Lord Eustace is a proud man. He wanted his guests to marvel at his treasure. He placed it in a vault that was, in reality, a stage. He stopped before a large framed architectural sketch of Hillingdon Manor that hung upon the wall. It was an old vellum drawing, yellowed at the edges, showing the structural renovations made during the Regency era. "Tell me, Watson, do you notice anything peculiar about the layout of the Great Hall in relation to the vault?" I joined him, squinting at the fine ink lines. "The vault is tucked into the thickness of the eastern wall. It shares a boundary with the old buttery, which is now the serving pantry." "Exactly. But look at the dimensions." Holmes traced a finger over the wall of the vault, the one containing the viewing port. "According to this plan, that wall is 3 feet thick. Yet when we stood inside the vault, did the depth of the window frame appear to be 3 feet? I cast my mind back. Now that you mention it, no. It seemed no more than 6 or 9 inches deep." "A discrepancy," Holmes cried, his eyes flashing. "A hidden cavity. A false wall within the vault itself." He snatched up his magnifying glass and hurried back toward the great hall, which was now deserted, save for a few servants polishing the floor. We reached the viewing port from the outside. Holmes did not look through the glass. Instead, he examined the masonry surrounding the frame. "Look here, Watson," he whispered, pointing to a hairline fracture in the mortar, so fine it appeared as nothing more than a cobweb. "This stone has been moved recently. And see the floor?" He knelt, pointing to the heavy Persian rug that ran along the base of the wall. When he peeled back the corner, a small circular indentation was visible in the floorboards, the exact size of a heavy-duty caster wheel. The entire wall, the port, the frame, and a section of the interior tiling is on a pivot. I gasped. "Not a pivot, Watson, a slide. But that is not the inconsistency that truly bothers me." Holmes stood up, his face clouded with a rare expression of doubt. "I found saltpeter on the pedestal. Saltpeter is used to create a smoke pot effect in theatrical productions. It provides the flash and the haze. But if the thief simply slid the wall to swap the clock for an empty pedestal, why use the saltpeter at all? It is an unnecessary flourish that risks detection." He walked back into the vault, which Gregory had since cordoned off. Holmes ignored the pedestal this time. He went to the corner of the room near the ceiling where the electric wires entered the chamber. "Watson, give me a boost." I braced myself against the wall and Holmes scrambled onto my shoulders. He remained there for several minutes, his breathing shallow as he examined the wiring. "Interesting," he muttered. "Most interesting. The wires have been bled, stripped of their insulation and tapped into, but not to cut the power, Watson, to increase it. Someone was drawing an enormous amount of current into this room, far more than a single light bulb requires." He jumped down, landing lightly on his feet. He looked at his hands. They were stained with a fine, oily soot. The ozone, the saltpeter, the flicker, the false wall. Holmes listed them off, his voice growing faster. "They are all pieces of a puzzle, but they belong to different pictures. Someone is trying to make a simple theft look like a scientific miracle, while someone else is trying to make a scientific miracle look like a simple theft. But who, Holmes? And where is the clock? The clock, my dear Watson, has never left this room. Or if it has, it did so in a way that would make Professor Vane's physics books burst into flame." He turned to the door, his gaze fixed on the heavy Chubb lock. "We have been looking at the suspects, Watson. We should have been looking at the victim. Lord Eustace said he had the only key, but he did not say he was the only person who knew how to use it." At that moment, a shrill cry echoed from the upper floors, the sound of a woman in total hysterics. We raced toward the stairs, where we found the head housekeeper, her face white with terror, pointing toward Lord Eustace's private study. "He's gone," she wailed. "His lordship! I went to bring him his tea, and the room is empty, and the door was locked from the inside. The study of Lord Eustace Pendergast was situated in the west wing, a secluded corner of the manor reachable only by a narrow wood-panelled corridor." When Watson and I arrived, breathless, we found Inspector Gregory already there, his face a mask of official frustration. He was rattling the heavy oak handle of the door with a violence that threatened to splinter the frame. "It's no use, Mr. Holmes," Gregory shouted. Over the din. "The bolt is thrown from the inside. I've called for the master of the house through the wood, but there is nothing, not even the sound of breathing." "The windows, Gregory?" Holmes asked, his eyes darting to the heavy velvet runner beneath our feet. 30 feet above the frozen moat, sir. Not even a cat could scale that masonry in this fog. And the ground below is undisturbed snow. Holmes leaned his ear against the door, his long, tapering fingers splayed against the wood. He stood like a statue for a full minute, his expression one of intense, almost painful concentration. Then he stepped back and looked at me. "Watson, your shoulder, if you please." "Gregory, on 3. With a collective heave, the three of us threw our weight against the oak. There was a sickening crack of timber, and the door flew inward, the iron bolt tearing clean out of the masonry. We stumbled into the room, expecting to find the master of the house slumped over his desk, or perhaps the victim of some foul play. The room was empty. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls of books. A tea tray sat on a low table, the steam still rising from a porcelain cup. A half-eaten scone sat on a plate. By all appearances, Lord Eustace had been there mere moments ago, but of the man himself there was no sign. "God in heaven," Gregory whispered, removing his hat. "It's happened again. First the clock, and now the man." I walked to the windows. They were heavy, leaded glass casements, and as Gregory had noted, the brass latches were firmly turned and locked from the inside. I looked out into the grey soup of the afternoon. The snow on the narrow ledge was pristine, marked only by the light dusting of frost. "Holmes, this is madness," I said, turning back. "The door was bolted. The windows are locked. Unless Lord Eustace has the ability to turn into smoke and drift up the chimney, he cannot have left this room." Holmes, however, was not looking at the windows. He was standing by the desk, his gaze fixed on a heavy, leather-bound volume that lay open near the tea tray. It was a treatise on the optical properties of prisms. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping to that low, vibrant tone that signaled a discovery. He pointed to the teacup. "The tea is hot. The Lord was here. But look at the saucer." I looked. A small, dark puddle of liquid had formed in the curve of the saucer. It was not the amber color of tea, but a thick, oily black. "Ink?" I ventured. "No. It is the same residue I found on the wiring in the vault," Holmes replied. He dipped a finger into the liquid and sniffed it. "Ozone and graphite. And look at the chair." The heavy, high-backed armchair where Lord Eustace usually sat was positioned directly in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror. Holmes stepped toward the mirror, his reflection ghost-like in the dim light. He did not look at his own image. Instead, he began to tap the glass with his knuckles, moving from the top to the bottom. Suddenly he stopped. He turned to us, his eyes burning with an erratic, almost frantic energy. "Gregory, get the servants. I want every person who was in the great hall last night lined up in the gallery. Now." "But Mr. Holmes, surely the search for his lordship—" "The search is over, Gregory," Holmes snapped, his voice echoing like a pistol shot. "We are no longer looking for a man. We are looking for a masterpiece of misdirection. Watson, stay here. Do not let anyone, not even the inspector, touch that tea tray. And for God's sake, keep your revolver ready. The ghost of Hillingdon Manor may decide to return for his tea." With that, Holmes vanished into the corridor, his footsteps fading as he raced toward the east wing. I stood in the silent study, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the oppressive stillness. I looked at the mirror, then at the locked windows, then at the empty chair. The sense of some invisible, malevolent presence was so strong that I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Holmes was right. The geometry was wrong. But as I stared at the empty room, I realized with a shudder that it wasn't just the geometry that was failing us. It was the very fabric of reality. When I rejoined Holmes in the great hall, I found him in a state of nervous agitation that would have alarmed anyone unacquainted with his methods. He had stripped off his ulster and silk cravat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal his thin, sinewy forearms. He was directing 2 bewildered footmen in the relocation of a massive, freestanding pier glass, the very mirror from Lord Eustace's study. "Carefully, carefully, you clumsy fellows," Holmes barked, his eyes darting between the mirror's positioning and the reinforced viewing port of the vault. A single degree of deviation, and the entire optical chain is severed. "Watson, to me!" I hurried forward, dodging a housemaid who was weeping into her apron. "Holmes, what in the world is the meaning of this? Lord Eustace is still missing, and Gregory is nearly ready to arrest Professor Vane for kidnapping. Let Gregory play with his handcuffs, Watson. We are dealing with a brain far more subtle than that of a frantic physicist. Holmes seized my arm, his grip like a vice. Did you observe the tea tray as I instructed? Did anything move? Nothing, Holmes. The room remained as silent as a tomb. Splendid. Now, look through this. He shoved me toward the viewing port of the vault. I peered through the thick glass into the empty chamber. The pedestal stood alone in the center, bathed in the harsh glare of the overhead electric bulb. Now, Holmes whispered, his voice vibrating with excitement. Watch the light. Professor Vane, if you please. From the shadows of the gallery, the trembling Professor Vane, under the watchful eye of a constable, threw a switch on his heavy battery set. The induction coil began to hum, a low, predatory growl that set my teeth on edge. The smell of ozone, that sharp, metallic tang, suddenly flooded the hall. Observe the pedestal, Watson. As the hum of the coil reached a crescendo, the light inside the vault seemed to vibrate. For a fleeting second, the image of the pedestal blurred, as if seen through a veil of rising heat. Then, a thick white mist, the unmistakable vapor of saltpeter, erupted inside the sealed room. "The flicker!" I cried. "It's happening again!" "No, Watson," Holmes shouted over the roar of the coil. "It is not happening again. It is being reconstructed." Suddenly, the pier glass Holmes had positioned behind us caught a beam of light from the hall's chandelier. The reflection bounced off the glass port, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a ghostly image superimposed over the empty pedestal. It was the Hillingdon timepiece, its sapphire heart glowing with a malevolent blue light. Then, with a crackle of blue sparks, the image vanished, and the vault was empty once more. The professor cut the power. Silence crashed back into the room, heavier than before. "You saw it," Holmes panted, his face drenched in sweat. "A phantom, Holmes. A mere reflection. A mirage, Watson. A clever application of Pepper's ghost, enhanced by a high-frequency discharge. But the mirage requires a physical object to reflect. The clock was never in the vault during the countdown. It was outside, and we were looking at its reflection projected into the chamber by a series of concealed mirrors and the very glass port we trusted." "But Lord Eustace?" Arthur Pendergast stepped forward from the shadows, his face haggard. "If the clock was outside, where is it now? And where is my uncle?" Holmes turned to him, his eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of grey. "Your uncle, Mr. Pendergast, is the victim of his own vanity. He wished to create a theft so impossible that it would baffle the world and, perhaps, allow him to collect a staggering insurance sum for a debt-ridden estate. He employed the theatrical sciences to stage a miracle." "You mean he stole his own clock?" I asked. "He attempted to. But the stage manager I mentioned earlier, the one who added the graphite and the saltpeter, had a different script in mind. Lord Eustace didn't vanish into thin air, Mr. Pendergast. He was pulled through the very geometry he tried to manipulate." Holmes walked to the pier glass and struck the surface with his palm. "The mirror in the study, Watson, the oily residue. Someone didn't just project an image, they used a sliding mechanism, a vanishing cabinet, on a grand architectural scale. Lord Eustace thought he was hiding the clock. Instead, he was hiding himself. His face suddenly went pale. He spun around, looking at the great hall's massive oak doors, which were now being bolted by a man I had not noticed before, the Count's silent, dark-clad valet. "Holmes," I warned, reaching for my revolver. "Too late, Watson," Holmes cried, his voice filled with a sudden, terrible clarity. "The second crime isn't the kidnapping, it's the execution. The ozone wasn't just for the effect, it was to mask the scent of a much more volatile chemical. If my calculations are correct, Hillingdon Manor is no longer a house. It is a giant primed tinderbox." Just then, a muffled explosion rocked the floor beneath our feet, and a thick black smoke began to curl from the vents of the vault. The black, roiling clouds that poured from the vault's vents were not the product of a common hearth fire. They carried the sickly, garlic-like stench of white phosphorus. Panic, sharp and infectious, tore through the great hall. Servants scrambled for the exits, only to find the heavy oak doors barred from the outside. Inspector Gregory was shouting orders that were swallowed by the cacophony of breaking glass and the roar of the chemical reaction. "Watson, your handkerchief. Dampen it and tie it across your face." Holmes's voice was a clarion call above the din. He had already fashioned a mask for himself, and was dragging a heavy, water-soaked tapestry from the wall. The phosphorus is a diversion, a smoke screen to cover the retrieval of the prize and the disposal of the witness. Where are we going, Holmes? I coughed, the acrid fumes stinging my lungs as I drew my Webley. To the buttery. The geometry dictates it. If the vault wall slides, it must slide into the space behind it. We have been looking at the stage, Watson. It is time we went backstage. We plunged into the servants' corridor, a narrow, dark artery of the house now choked with grey haze. Holmes moved with an uncanny certainty, his hand trailing along the wainscoting until he found what he was looking for. A recessed brass handle disguised as a coat hook. He wrenched it, and a section of the wood panelling swung inward. We stepped into a cramped mechanical nightmare. Here, in the hollow space between the great hall and the pantry, was the skeleton of the deception. I saw a series of heavy iron rails, a massive counterweight system, and a collection of angled mirrors. In the center of this hidden chamber sat the vanishing cabinet, a padded, upright box on a silent track, and inside it, bound and gagged, was Lord Eustace Pendergast. Quickly, Watson, the man is nearly suffocated. As I worked to loosen the Lord's bonds, Holmes ignored us. He was staring at the far end of the chamber, where a second set of rails led toward the exterior coal chute. A low, rhythmic humming echoed through the space, the sound of a small electric winch. "He is early," Holmes whispered, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. The smoke was meant to last longer. "He is coming for the timepiece now." "Who, Holmes? Count Silvius?" "The Count is the hand, Watson, but the brain is far more domestic. Quiet behind the mirrors." We crouched in the shadows just as a panel at the far end of the room slid open. A figure entered, silhouetted against the dim light of the pantry. He did not wear the flamboyant mask of the previous night, but his movements were precise, athletic, and entirely devoid of the nervous twitching I had seen earlier. It was Professor Vane, but the professor's frantic demeanor had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating efficiency. He didn't notice us. His eyes were fixed on a small velvet-lined satchel resting on a ledge near the winch. He reached for it, his fingers closing around the glinting sapphire of the Hillingdon timepiece. "A remarkable experiment in light refraction, Professor," Holmes said, stepping into the faint light. He held his hands casually in his pockets, but his stance was that of a coiled spring. Vane spun around, a small silver-plated derringer appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Mr. Holmes, you are more persistent than the fog, and you are more of an engineer than a physicist," Holmes countered, his voice steady. "The smoke pot in the vault, the phosphorus to mask the smell of the ozone, the clever use of the pier glass to project the image of the clock while you slid the real one into this cavity. It was a masterpiece of theatrical larceny. You didn't just steal the clock, you stole the very air from Lord Eustace's lungs to ensure he wouldn't interrupt the transition." Vane sneered, his eyes darting toward the coal chute. The Lord was a fool. He wanted a miracle to claim his insurance. I merely provided a miracle that he wouldn't live to explain. And now, Mr. Holmes, I fear your own observation is about to come to a permanent end. He leveled the derringer at Holmes's heart. I raised my Webley, but Holmes held up a sharp, commanding hand. "I wouldn't, Professor," Holmes said mildly. "You see, while you were so carefully arranging your mirrors, I took the liberty of adjusting one of my own. Watson, the lamp. I didn't understand, but I obeyed. I snatched a bullseye lantern from a nearby shelf and shuttered it open. The beam struck the large pier glass Holmes had insisted on moving earlier. Because of the angle Holmes had set, the light bounced through the viewing port, hit a secondary mirror in the hidden chamber, and reflected directly into Vane's face with the intensity of a searchlight. Blinded, Vane cried out and fired wildly. The bullet whined off an iron rail. In that second of distraction, Holmes was upon him. It was not a struggle, it was an execution of martial science. With a swift baritsu throw, Holmes sent the professor crashing into the padded interior of the vanishing cabinet. Before Vane could recover, Holmes slammed the cabinet door shut and threw the heavy exterior bolt. "The beauty of a vanishing cabinet, Watson," Holmes panted, adjusting his cuffs, "is that it works both ways. The professor has just performed his final trick. But the fire, Holmes, the Great Hall, a mere chemical flare, Watson. It will burn itself out in minutes. The explosion was a pressurized canister of carbon dioxide I planted in the vents to snuff the phosphorus. I believe we shall find Inspector Gregory has managed to open the doors by now. Let us go and see if the Count's valet is still waiting by the coal chute to receive a clock that will never arrive." The great hall was a scene of controlled chaos. The thick, white phosphorus smoke had been replaced by the cooling grey mist of the carbon dioxide Holmes had deployed. Inspector Gregory, his uniform dusted with white powder, stood over a trembling Lord Eustace, who was being revived with a stiff brandy. The guests, their masks now removed, to reveal faces etched with a mixture of terror and curiosity, huddled together in the centre of the room. Into this tableau stepped Sherlock Holmes. He had donned his ulster once more, and in his right hand he carried the Hillingdon timepiece. The star of the East Sapphire caught the dying light of the afternoon, pulsing with a deep oceanic blue that seemed to mock the grey fog outside. "The miracle, Gregory," Holmes announced, his voice ringing through the hall, "has been reduced to a matter of simple mechanics and theatrical vanity." He placed the clock on a table with a definitive thud. "Mr. Holmes," Gregory panted, "the professor is in the cabinet, and the Count's valet was caught at the coal chute with a steam launch waiting on the river." "But how? The vault was sealed." "It was never a vault, Gregory. It was a stage," Holmes said, pacing a slow circle around the recovered treasure. "The deception was twofold, a double deception, if you will. The first was authored by Lord Eustace himself. Facing mounting debts and an estate he could no longer maintain, he conceived a plan to lose his greatest asset. He hired Professor Vane, a man whose scientific credentials masked a desperate need for funding to create an impossible theft. The goal was to claim the insurance while keeping the clock in a secret compartment until it could be sold safely abroad. Lord Eustace buried his face in his hands, a groan of shame escaping him. "However," Holmes continued, his eyes flashing toward the study where we had found the empty chair, "the professor was far more ambitious than his employer. He didn't want a mere fee, he wanted the sapphire. He realized that if Lord Eustace disappeared along with the clock, the miracle would be so total that no one would look for a mundane mechanical explanation. They would look for ghosts, or they would blame the most obvious suspects, like Count Silvius." The Count, standing by the fireplace, inclined his head slightly. "A role I was uniquely suited for, it seems." "Indeed," Holmes remarked. Vane planted the induction coil and the wiring schematics in his own room to appear clumsy, knowing that a man of your reputation, Count, would be the primary target of suspicion. But he made several critical errors. The first was the saltpeter. "The saltpeter?" I asked. "Yes, Watson. To create the flicker and the smoke inside the vault, Vane used a theatrical flashpot. But saltpeter is a crystalline substance. In a sealed vault, it does not simply vanish, it settles. When I found those flakes on the pedestal, I knew we were looking at a stage-managed event. Then there was the ozone. Vane used a high-voltage discharge to create the smell, hoping it would suggest some futuristic transporter or electrical accident. But ozone is also a byproduct of heavy-duty electric motors, the kind needed to slide a 3-foot-thick section of masonry on iron rails." Holmes gestured toward the wall containing the viewing port. "The geometry of silence, Watson." The wall was a masterpiece of Regency engineering, updated with Victorian electricity. When the lights flickered, a deliberate surge created by Vane, the entire section of the wall slid 6 feet to the left, replacing the pedestal containing the clock with an identical empty one. To the 40 witnesses in the hall, looking through the glass port, the clock appeared to vanish in a heartbeat. In reality, they were looking at a different part of the wall entirely. "And the reflection I saw?" I asked. "The ghost of the clock?" "A classic Pepper's ghost illusion, Watson. Vane used the glass port as a partial mirror. By lighting the real clock in the hidden chamber behind the wall and keeping the vault dark, he could project a ghostly image of the timepiece onto the empty pedestal. When the vault lights came back on, the reflection vanished, and the miracle was complete." "But my uncle," Arthur Pendergast cried. "How did he vanish from a locked study?" "That was Vane's masterstroke," Holmes said, his voice dropping. "Lord Eustace was waiting in his study for the all-clear signal from Vane. The mirror in his study was the second exit, a sliding panel that led into the same hidden corridor. Vane told his lordship to step into the vanishing cabinet for his own safety. Once inside, Vane bolted the door, intending to leave Lord Eustace to suffocate while he made off with the sapphire via the coal chute. He used the phosphorus flare to create a panic, ensuring no one would notice him slipping away. Holmes turned to Lord Eustace, his expression softening into one of cold pity. "You played a dangerous game with a man more ruthless than yourself, my lord. You provided the stage, but the professor provided the trapdoor." The room was silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire. The complexity of the crime, so meticulously built on the foundations of physics and greed, stood exposed. "A New Year's mystery indeed," Gregory muttered, signaling his men to lead the disgraced Lord Eustace away. "I suppose we have you to thank for the aha moment, Mr. Holmes. Thank the saltpeter, Gregory," Holmes said, reaching for his pipe. "And never trust a man who claims to have bypassed the laws of physics. They are the only laws that cannot be bribed." The final act of the drama at Hillingdon Manor was played out not with a bang, but with the somber, rhythmic tread of the law. As the grey light of a New Year's afternoon began to fail, dissolving into a bruised purple twilight, the local constabulary led the protagonists of our mystery away. Professor Vane, his academic composure utterly shattered, was escorted to a waiting police carriage. He no longer looked like a man of science, he looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting with a frantic, impotent rage. He had played for the highest stakes, a king's ransom in sapphires, and had lost to a man who saw through his miracles as easily as if they were made of glass. Lord Eustace Pendergast presented a far more pathetic sight. The proud aristocrat, whose lineage stretched back to the Tudors, walked with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a disgrace that no amount of family history could wash away. He was not being arrested for the theft, for a man cannot technically steal from himself in the eyes of the common law, but the charges of insurance fraud, conspiracy, and the endangerment of life would ensure that the name Pendergast would be heard in the Old Bailey rather than the House of Lords. "A singular end to a noble house," I remarked, standing with Holmes on the gravel drive as the carriages pulled away. The fog had begun to thicken again, swallowing the tail lights of the police convoy. "Nobility, Watson, is a quality of the soul, not the bloodline," Holmes replied, lighting a cigarette. The orange glow of the tobacco illuminated the sharp angles of his face. Lord Eustace was a man who preferred the shadow of a lie to the light of a difficult truth. He sought to preserve his lifestyle by sacrificing his honor. In the end, he lost both. "And Count Silvius?" I asked, looking toward the dark silhouette of the Count's sleek black brougham, which remained idling near the gates. "The Count is a predator, Watson. He was here to scavenge. He knew Vane was up to something, and he was waiting to intercept the prize once it left the manor. But because he committed no overt act, Gregory has no grounds to hold him. He is free to return to his lair in the West End, though I suspect he will find London a bit too warm for his tastes after today." As if on cue, the Count's carriage door opened. The nobleman stepped out, his heavy Venetian cloak swirling around him. He walked toward us, stopping a few paces away. He did not look at me. His gaze was fixed entirely on Holmes. "You have a keen eye for the mechanics of the stage, Mr. Holmes," the Count said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. "It is a pity. You would have made a magnificent villain. I find the role of the critic far more intellectually satisfying, Count," Holmes countered coolly. "Critics, after all, are the only ones who see the play for what it truly is." The Count offered a faint, chilling smile, touched his hat, and vanished back into his carriage. A moment later, he was gone, a phantom returning to the shadows of the city. The journey back to Baker Street was a quiet affair. We reached the station at Hillingdon just as the evening train was departing. As we settled into a first-class carriage, the rhythmic clackety-clack of the wheels acting as a metronome to our thoughts, I found myself reflecting on the sheer intricacy of the case. "It is truly remarkable, Holmes," I said, leaning back against the plush cushions. "How you moved from a grain of saltpeter to a sliding wall and a kidnapping. To me, it was a chaotic jumble of impossible events. To you, it was a logical progression. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes, Watson," he replied, staring out at the darkened countryside. "The trick is not to look at the miracle, but at the preparations for the miracle. Vane needed power for his induction coil. He needed a space for his rails. He needed a distraction for his exit. Once you identify the requirements of a crime, the crime itself becomes a foregone conclusion. He fell silent for a long time, his long, thin fingers interlaced. "I am thinking of the Adair case again," he murmured, almost to himself. "The transition from the old year to the new. It is merely a human convention, Watson. The criminal mind does not reset its clock at midnight. It merely finds new ways to use the old darkness. By the time we reached 221 billions, the clocks of London were striking 10. Mrs. Hudson had left a cold supper on the sideboard and a fresh pot of tea by the fire. The room, with its familiar clutter of chemical apparatus, tobacco-filled Persian slippers, and stacks of newspapers, felt like a sanctuary after the cold, deceptive halls of Hillingdon Manor. Holmes took his seat in his armchair, the restless energy of the morning now replaced by a quiet, contemplative melancholy. He picked up his violin and began to play a low, mournful air, a melody that seemed to capture the very essence of the winter fog and the fleeting nature of human ambition. I sat by the fire, picking up my journal to record the day's events. It had been a New Year's Day unlike any other, a reminder that beneath the veneer of civilization, the most complex puzzles are often fueled by the simplest of human failings: greed, vanity, and the desire to be more than what we are. The embers in the hearth had faded to a dull, pulsing crimson, casting long, skeletal shadows across the walls of our sitting room. The rhythmic scraping of Holmes's bow against the strings of his Stradivarius had ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to weigh upon the very air. He sat with the instrument resting across his knees, his thin, aquiline features silhouetted against the dying firelight. For a long while he simply stared into the coals, as if reading the final lines of a story written in the ash. "You are unusually quiet, even for a successful man, Holmes," I remarked, closing my notebook and setting it atop the mahogany sideboard. The Hillingdon case was a triumph. The papers tomorrow will speak of nothing but the miracle of the vault and the man who saw through the veil. Surely you feel some small measure of satisfaction." Holmes turned his head slightly, a faint melancholy smile touching his lips. "Satisfaction, Watson? I feel the exhaustion of a man who has spent the day pulling weeds from a garden that will only grow more tomorrow." Vane was a clever weed, certainly. He understood the intersection of optics and avarice. But he was essentially a common creature. His motive was gold. His method was machinery. "There is no soul in such a crime." "But the complexity," I protested. "The sliding walls, the projected images, the use of phosphorus. It was a feat of ingenuity. It was a feat of theatre, Watson. And like all theatre, it relied upon the audience's desire to be deceived. Lord Eustace wanted to believe in a miracle so he could escape his debts. The guests wanted to believe in a miracle so they could have a story for their dinner parties. My role was merely to be the unwelcome stagehand who points out the wires and the trapdoors." He stood up, stretching his long limbs with a grace that belied the physical strain of the previous 24 hours. He walked to the window and pulled aside the heavy curtain. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a sliver of a pale, wintry moon hanging over the rooftops of Baker Street. "A new year," he murmured, his breath fogging the glass. 1895. "I wonder, Watson, how many more miracles this city has in store for us. How many more men will try to rewrite the laws of the universe to suit their own petty hungers. We build our civilization on logic and stone, yet we are always just one flicker of the lights away from falling back into the superstitions of the dark." "Perhaps," I said, moving to stand beside him, "but as long as there is a light to be held against that darkness, there is hope. You are that light for many, Holmes." He turned to me, his grey eyes softening with a rare moment of genuine affection. "You are the chronicler of the light, Watson. Without your records, I am merely a machine that solves equations. You give the equations a heart." He stepped away from the window and toward the mantelpiece, where a single, unopened telegram lay propped against a clock, a mundane, brass-faced thing that told the time without the need for sapphires or secrets. He snatched it up, tearing the envelope with a practiced flick of his thumb. I watched his expression shift. The weariness vanished instantly, replaced by that keen, predatory alertness that I knew so well. His nostrils flared, and his posture straightened like a bow being drawn to its full tension. "Aha!" he cried, a sharp bark of laughter escaping him. "It seems the new year is not content to let me rest on my laurels for even a single night." "What is it?" I asked, feeling the familiar stir of excitement in my own blood. "A new case?" "A message from the Swedish consulate," Holmes replied, his eyes dancing with a sudden, brilliant energy. "A matter of a missing treaty and a set of footprints found on a ceiling in Bloomsbury." "It sounds perfectly absurd, Watson. Truly, wonderfully absurd." He tossed the telegram onto the table and reached for his pipe, already reaching for the shag tobacco in the toe of his Persian slipper. The melancholy of the Hillingdon aftermath had evaporated like the morning mist. "Footprints on a ceiling?" I repeated, reaching for my own coat. "That is a physical impossibility, Holmes. Is it, Watson, or is it merely a geometry we have yet to understand?" He struck a match, the flare illuminating a face that was once again alive with the joy of the hunt. "Come, my dear doctor, the game is afoot, and the night is young. Let us see if 1895 can provide a riddle that even the laws of gravity cannot explain." As we descended the stairs into the biting chill of the London night, I looked at the tall, lean figure of my friend striding ahead of me into the gloom. I knew not what lay ahead in the foggy alleyways of Bloomsbury, but I knew that as long as Sherlock Holmes walked the streets of London, no mystery was too deep, no deception too dark, and no miracle too impossible to be brought into the cold, clear light of reason. The trial of Professor Septimus Vane and the subsequent inquiry into the affairs of Lord Eustace Pendergast occupied the front pages of the Gazette and the Times for the better part of February. It was a scandal that titillated the public imagination, a blend of high society desperation and the dark application of scientific genius. I watched from the gallery of the Old Bailey as Vane, stripped of his academic laurels, attempted to argue that his experiment was a misunderstood pursuit of pure physics, and that the kidnapping of Lord Eustace had been a secondary, unintended consequence of a mechanical malfunction. The jury, however, was not composed of physicists, but of 12 stolid Londoners who took a dim view of being blinded by phosphorus and locked in vanishing cabinets. Vane was sentenced to a long term of penal servitude, while Lord Eustace, broken in spirit and health, was allowed to retire to a quiet estate in the north, his reputation a charred ruin. It was a week after the sentencing that Holmes and I found ourselves once again in the quiet sanctuary of 221B. The Bloomsbury ceiling case had been resolved with Holmes's usual brisk efficiency. It had turned out to be a matter of a trained macaque and a very specific brand of magnetic boots, and we were enjoying a rare evening of undisturbed leisure. Holmes was occupied with a large leather-bound ledger in which he meticulously pasted clippings related to the Hillingdon affair. He paused, his scissors hovering over a sketch of the Star of the East sapphire. "You know, Watson," he said, his voice trailing off into a thoughtful cadence, "the public loves a miracle, but they loathe the magician once the trick is explained." Vane's tragedy wasn't his crime, it was his lack of restraint. Had he merely stolen the clock, he might have escaped. It was the desire to make the theft impossible that led to his undoing. "It was a masterpiece of misdirection nonetheless," I said, looking up from my book. "I still find myself marveling at the sliding wall. The sheer weight of the masonry involved." "Weight is an illusion when one understands the lever," Holmes replied, tapping the sketch of the sapphire. "But tell me, Watson, did you notice nothing peculiar about the recovery of the gem itself? When I handed it back to Lord Eustace in the Great Hall, did you observe his expression?" He looked relieved, naturally, as if a death sentence had been commuted. "He looked surprised," Holmes corrected, a sharp glint returning to his eyes. "And not just at the fact that I had found it. He looked at the stone as if it were a stranger." I frowned. "What are you suggesting, Holmes? That it wasn't the real sapphire?" Holmes reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and produced a small velvet-lined box. He clicked it open. Inside lay a single gleaming blue stone, nearly identical in cut and color to the Star of the East. "Holmes," I gasped, "is that this?" "No, this is a highly sophisticated piece of strontium titanate, colored with cobalt and treated with a specific refractive coating. I found it in Vane's laboratory when I returned there secretly the morning after the arrest. Vane hadn't just planned to steal the clock, he had planned to replace the sapphire with this. Lord. Eustace would have been left with a counterfeit, never realizing the switch had occurred during the vanishing act. Then the stone you returned to the Lord was the real one, of course, Holmes said, snapping the box shut. I intercepted Vane before he could make the swap, but the existence of the counterfeit tells us something vital about the professor's mind. He wasn't just a thief, he was an author. He wanted to write a lie so perfect that the truth would never even be suspected. He wanted the miracle to remain a miracle forever, with the evidence hidden in plain sight on Lord Eustace's mantelpiece. He stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, placing the velvet box behind a bust of Napoleon. The Hillingdon case was a study in the geometry of silence, Watson. But the silence wasn't in the vault. It was in the hearts of the men involved. One man was silent because of his debts, the other was silent because of his ego. I merely broke the silence by speaking the language of the physical world. And the sapphire? I asked. Where is it now? The Hillingdon estate has been liquidated to pay the creditors, Holmes sighed. The Star of the East has been purchased by a private collector in America. It will sit in a safe, far from the fog of London and the vanity of desperate lords. It is perhaps the best place for it. Some things are too beautiful to be kept in a house built on secrets. He picked up his violin once more, but he did not play. He simply stood there, looking out at the street lamps of Baker Street. The ledger is closed, Watson. We have stripped the mask from the new year. Now we must wait and see what 1895 decides to wear next. I believe I hear the sound of a hansom cab slowing down outside. If I am not mistaken, that is the rhythmic, heavy tread of a man who has lost something far more valuable than a clock. I listened, and indeed, the sound of boots on the stairs echoed through the house. The cycle was beginning again. The tragedy, the puzzle, and the pursuit. The world is never truly quiet, is it, Holmes? Never, Watson. And for that, we should be profoundly grateful. The year 1895 had begun with a riddle that challenged the very foundations of our perceptions, and as the weeks turned into months, the case of the new year at 221B took its place in my burgeoning collection of records. I sat one evening in late March, the spring air finally beginning to peel away the stubborn layers of London's winter soot, and looked over the finished manuscript of the Hillingdon affair. Holmes was across from me, his head wreathed in the blue smoke of his morning pipe, occupied with a series of intricate calculations involving the trajectory of a bullet fired through a moving window. "You are looking at the Hillingdon notes again, Watson," he observed, without lifting his eyes from his ledger. "I can hear the specific scratch of your pen when you reach the concluding moral. It is always a heavier, more deliberate stroke." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "It is a story that bears reflection, Holmes. It represents a quintessential victory of logic over the spectacular. In an age where men are so eager to believe in the supernatural, you remain the solitary guardian of the rational." Holmes laid down his pen and looked at me, his eyes dark and inscrutable. "The rational is often more terrifying than the supernatural, Watson. A ghost is a whim of the imagination, it has no rules. But a man like Vane, who uses the immutable laws of light and motion to bury his fellow man alive, that is a horror born of absolute certainty. He didn't just break the law, he recruited the universe to help him do it. And yet, you stopped him, I countered. You saw the grain of saltpeter. You saw the scoring on the floor. You saw the truth when 40 others saw a miracle. I saw what was there, Watson. The difficulty is that most people see what they wish was there. Lord Eustace wished for a disappearance to solve his debts, and so he saw one. The guests wished for a sensation to enliven their dull lives, and so they saw one. Reality is a fragile thing, held together by the collective agreement of the observers. When one man decides to look at the angles instead of the image, the illusion collapses. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling life of Baker Street, the hansom cabs, the flower girls, the city men in their silk hats, all moving in a complex interlocking dance of human necessity. "We live in a world of sliding walls, Watson," he said softly. "Not all of them are made of stone and iron. We build walls of etiquette, walls of tradition, and walls of secret shames. Every case we have investigated is merely an attempt to peer behind the masonry of the human heart. The Hillingdon timepiece was just a clock. The real mystery was the ticking of the souls inside that manor. I looked at the manuscript on my knee. I had titled it The Case of the New Year, but I realized now that it was truly a study in the persistence of shadow. Holmes turned back to me, his expression shifting from philosophical detachment to that sudden, bright-eyed energy that characterized his most vibrant moments. But come, we must not become overly solemn. The sun is setting, and the night, as it always does in this great cesspool of a city, promises new entanglements. That telegram from the Duke of Holderness still sits unanswered on the mantel, and I believe there is a singular problem regarding a missing thoroughbred in Newmarket that requires our immediate attention. You never rest, Holmes, I said, rising to join him. Rest is for the dull, Watson. The brain is a fire that must be fed. If I am not solving a problem, I am consuming myself. I prefer the problem. He reached for his hat and coat, the familiar silhouette of the great detective once again ready for the fray. As I followed him down the stairs and out into the cooling evening air, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The world might be a place of deception and hidden motives, of sliding walls and impossible disappearances, but as long as I walked the streets with Sherlock Holmes, I knew that the light of reason would never truly be extinguished. The Hillingdon timepiece was gone, sold to a distant shore, and the actors of that drama were scattered to the winds of justice and exile. But the truth remained, methodical, cold, and brilliant. We stepped into a waiting hansom, the horses' hooves sparking against the cobblestones, and vanished into the gathering fog, ready to face whatever new riddles the year 1895 had yet to unveil.